You ever stop and think about the hidden rules behind big decisions? You know, like mask mandates or quarantine orders. It turns out these choices aren't just made on a whim. No, they're actually shaped by a really deep, complex ethical framework, one that's designed to protect all of us. So, the big question is, how do public health officials make these huge life-altering decisions? Well, let's break down their playbook.
Okay, so at the very heart of pretty much every single public health debate, there's this fundamental tension, right? It's the question, where does my personal freedom end and where does my responsibility to the community begin? This is the classic individual rights versus the collective good dilemma. And honestly, finding that sweet spot, that perfect balance, it's one of the toughest challenges we face as a society.
All right, so you might think the ethics that guide your personal doctor, the one-on-one stuff, would just apply to a pandemic. But here's the thing, they really don't. Protecting millions of people requires a completely different ethical model than just treating a single patient. So here's the crucial difference. Your doctor's number one duty is to you, period. They're focused on your personal health, your choices. But a public health official? They're responsible for the entire population. They have to juggle your individual rights against the health and safety of whole communities with all their different beliefs and needs. It's like switching from a microscope focused on one cell to a wide-angle lens trying to capture the whole landscape.
So, if the old rules don't apply, then what does? Well, this is where it gets interesting. Officials rely on a very specific ethical toolkit. It's basically a framework designed to help them justify actions that might, step on individual liberties, but for the sake of the common good.
And this toolkit, it's not just a vague idea. It's built around 4 core principles. You can think of it like an ethical checklist that any public health action has to pass before it can be put into practice.
Okay, so this checklist has 4 key steps. We've got the harm principle, the principle of least restrictive means, the reciprocity principle, and finally, the transparency principle. Let's break down what each of those actually means, starting with the first and honestly the most important one.
First up is the bedrock of this whole thing, an idea from the philosopher John Stuart Mill. It's called the harm principle. And it's simple but powerful. The government can only step in and interfere with your freedom to stop you from harming someone else. It's not about protecting you from yourself. That's not a good enough reason. This is the first, and you could say the highest, hurdle that any public health measure has to clear.
Okay, so once an action clears the harm principle, the next step is what's called the principle of least restrictive means. Think of it like a ladder of intervention. You don't just jump to the top rung, the most severe option. No way. You start at the bottom with things like education, public service announcements, just trying to get people to comply voluntarily. And only if that fails do you start climbing the ladder to more serious actions, like regulations, or in really extreme cases, things like detention.
This next one, it's all about fairness. It's the reciprocity principle. And it basically says that if society asks you to shoulder a burden for the greater good, say, isolating and losing income for 2 weeks, then society owes you something back. It has a duty to help you out. That could mean financial support or providing a safe place to quarantine, whatever it takes. It's a two-way street. It's a deal.
And finally, we have the transparency principle. This one is absolutely crucial for building and maintaining public trust. The idea is that these big decisions can't be made in some secret closed-door meeting. The reasoning has to be out in the open. The process has to be clear. And everyone who's affected should have a voice. Because without that transparency, you can bet that public trust and cooperation will just fall apart.
So, okay, those are the 4 principles. But theory is one thing, right? How does this framework actually work in the real world? Let's look at 2 very different cases to see it in action. One where the threat is super clear, and another one where things get a lot more murky.
All right, our first case study. Imagine a man who is homeless and has active infectious tuberculosis, and he's not taking his medication. Let's run this through our framework. Is the harm principle met? Absolutely. He could easily infect others in a crowded shelter. What about least restrictive means? Yep, they have to start with education and supportive therapy first. Reciprocity? That's meant by providing him with supportive housing so he can comply. And transparency? The whole process is open and he has access to a lawyer. See? In this case, every single box on the checklist is ticked. It's pretty clear-cut.
But that was a pretty straightforward case. And let's be real, public health is rarely that simple. So what happens when the science is fuzzy? When the harm we're talking about is more of a fear than a scientifically proven fact?
Let's take a look at our second case. Imagine a community that's convinced that chemicals in their drinking water are making people sick.
So a scientific study is done, but the results are inconclusive. It doesn't find a direct link, but the data is kind of weak, so it can't definitively rule one out either. So now you have a community that is still really afraid, and their stress, their anxiety, that's very real.
So in this scenario, right off the bat, our very first principle, the harm principle, is on some really shaky ground. Scientifically speaking, there's no proven physical harm. But couldn't you argue that the community's intense fear and psychological distress is a type of harm in itself? This is where the framework doesn't just hand you an easy answer.
But even though that first principle is murky, the framework still gives us a path forward. It tells us what not to do. Forcing some big, expensive cleanup isn't justified because the harm isn't proven. But this is where the other principles become even more important. Reciprocity and transparency are now essential. The health department has an ethical duty to keep the lines of communication wide open, to be totally transparent, and to work with the community to address their fears and rebuild trust, even when the science isn't certain.
You know, this second case really shines a light on a deep truth about public health. It operates on a totally different logic than pure science. A lot of the time, public health just can't afford to sit around and wait for absolute 100% proof. There's this fantastic quote from A.B. Hill, who is a pioneer in epidemiology, that just nails this idea. He said, "In asking for very strong evidence, I would repeat emphatically that this does not imply crossing every T and swords with every critic before we act." What he's saying is that public health is all about prevention. If you wait for perfect, airtight evidence, you might wait too long and people will get hurt. Sometimes you just have to act on the best evidence you have at the time.
Let's just put these two mindsets side by side. A research scientist, they set the bar for proof incredibly high because their biggest fear is being wrong, publishing something that turns out to be false. But in public health, the goal is totally different. It's prevention. And the biggest fear is failing to act and watching people get sick or die. So they often must act on incomplete evidence. There's even a name for this idea of taking the safer route when you're not sure. It's called tutorialism.
And here's another key point. The amount of evidence you need isn't always the same. It all depends on how much you're asking of people. So to issue a simple warning, maybe to pregnant women about a potential risk, you might only need a little bit of evidence. To change the rules at a workplace, okay, you'll need a fair amount of evidence for that. But to justify big interventions into people's private lives and lifestyles, man, you better have some really, really strong evidence. The burden of proof scales right along with the burden on people's freedom. So when you put it all together, you really start to see the core challenge of public health. It's this incredibly delicate balancing act, right? It's grounded in these deep ethical principles, and it absolutely requires our participation and, most importantly, our trust to work.
So what's the big takeaway here? What should you remember from all this? First, public health ethics is not the same as your doctor's ethics. It's its own unique field, constantly trying to balance our individual freedoms with the good of the whole community. It uses that four-part checklist to justify its actions: harm, least restriction, reciprocity, and transparency. But maybe the most crucial lesson is this. In the world of prevention, waiting for perfect proof can be a luxury we just don't have. Sometimes action has to come before all the facts are in. And that leaves us with one last really big question. As we face all these new and unpredictable threats, future pandemics, climate change, you name it, the real test is going to be applying this ethical framework wisely and fairly. So how do we, as a society, make sure that these incredibly powerful decisions are made in a way that protects both our health and our freedom, and at the end of the day actually earns our trust?